conform feedback-ului pe care l-am avut mai adineauri, mergem, se pare, strict pe limba engleză, fără traducere. Încă o dată întreb, toată lumea e confortabilă cu asta? Dacă... da? Vor fi și slide-uri, deci într-o anumită măsură, cred că ne ajută și ele. So, it sounds like we can go just with the English, without the Romanian translation.
A brave audience.
And, yeah. Bun, îmi face deosebită plăcere să vă spun tuturor bun venit în seara aceasta la Areopagus, la acest forum pe o temă de interes important, interes mare pentru lumea în care trăim. Consider că toți deja ați avut ocazia probabil să vedeți titlul întâlnirii noastre privitor la decepția neo-ateismului și, desigur, unul dintre personajele cheie în toată mișcarea aceasta a neo-ateismului este Richard Dawkins, deci o să fie o prezentare în mod special pe marginea lucrărilor sale, dar și cu referire la argumentul teist, sau pentru existența lui Dumnezeu, inspirat din design. Și pentru aceasta ne face deosebită plăcere să-l avem cu noi în seara aceasta pe Peter Williams. Probabil că unii l-ați mai auzit, poate pe internet, sau însă a mai fost odată în Timișoara, cu mai mulți ani în urmă. Deci este a doua oară aici în Timișoara. A venit acum și la Timișoara și urmează să meargă la Iași, la Universitate, pentru o prelegere acolo. Deci cea mai mare parte a acestei serii va consta în prezentarea ce urmează, după care o să fie și un timp de interacțiune, întrebări, discuții pe marginea celor prezentate, iar în final, după cum poate ați văzut și în afiș, ne bucurăm să vă prezentăm și 3 numere noi din seria Cambridge Papers, o serie valoroasă, considerăm noi, și ne bucurăm că putem să o facem disponibilă și cititorilor de limbă română. Deci câteva cuvinte doar în final o să fie despre aceste ultime 3 numere pe care le lansăm în seara aceasta. So, Peter, it's a real joy to have you with us this evening, and thank you so much for accepting our invitation and traveling from London to Timișoara, and then we know you're going to Iași and so on. So, we are here looking forward to what you have prepared to share with us this evening, like we've agreed. It will be mainly your presentation, the first part, and then room for some discussions.
Great.
Okay, thank you again, and hai să-l încurajăm.
And as I go through, because we're trying to do this all in English, and particularly since inevitably I will end up dealing with some technical issues, although I'm trying to communicate it as easily for you as I can. If there are points of clarification or you need something translated, then we can pause for that. But if we can try and keep the sort of substantive discussion and questions about the material until after the presentation, I think that will work best. If you do...
Subliniez și eu aspectul acesta. Dacă la un moment dat vă dați seama că începeți să pierdeți argumente principale, dați un semnal și putem ajuta cu de traducere pe anumite componente. So, I just remind.
If you do want to find out more about me or my publications, find out my website address, find out about my podcast, etc., do take with you one of these giant business cards that I've had printed that give you various recommended readings and all sorts of useful information. So I'm going to talk about Richard Dawkins, and particularly his best-selling book, The God Delusion, which recently came out in a second edition with a new foreword written by Dawkins defending what he sees as his key points in the book against some of the criticism that has been made against that book. Dawkins is perhaps the most famous British atheist. He's a zoologist. by background and published a number of very well-selling popular science books, but in more recent years has turned his intellectual firepower upon religion in general and Christianity in particular. And his book, The God Delusion, which was part of this new or neo-atheist publishing wave at the beginning of the 21st century, sold over 3 million copies, and as I say, recently he's come out into a second edition as well. I want to say a little bit about arguments for God, theistic arguments. What arguments for God are trying to do is to formalize, to rationally motivate our recognition of relationships that hold between God and God's creation. Where each of those relationships that you can uncover and make explicit with an argument adds to our overall picture of God. So it's rare for a philosopher to try and make an argument that will do the whole thing in one. And more common these days for people to think that it's the fact that we have lots of different arguments that are all pointing in the same general direction, each of which adds to your picture of the nature of this reality behind the mundane physical universe that we recognize around us. Hence the picture of the jigsaw puzzle. So kind of gradually building up each jigsaw piece as a different argument in a cumulative case, a cumulative argument for theism. Now, many of those relationships between God and creation that these arguments purport to point out to us are things that are actually intuitively perceived by most people, I would say. And that explains why most people believe in God. Just in terms of the percentage of the world population who believe in a creator God. Even down to the fact that I've got some interesting statistics here about the majority of agnostics believe in a higher power. Some agnostics even say they believe in God as described in the Bible. And yet they self-identify as agnostics, perhaps because they don't identify with any particular religious denomination or tradition of organized religion. So they call themselves agnostics. So the number of people who believe in some kind of creator, some kind of God, some kind of transcendent personal reality behind the universe is very large. And I think that's because it's an intuitive belief for people. Whether or not you think that intuition is mistaken or correct, well, that's something that we get into when we start arguing through the arguments for and against theism. Daniel Dennett, who is a neo-atheist philosopher, praises Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, for, as he says, flattening all the serious arguments for the existence of God. And I've just put in brackets there, it doesn't, because it doesn't. There is indeed a wider range of arguments for God than most people, including Richard Dawkins, realise. So Richard Dawkins in The God Delusion, in the first edition, devoted 37 pages of his book to wrestling with, and I would say quite a shallow way, the philosophical arguments for the existence of God. He discusses 10 theistic arguments that he separates out. Well, compare that to the fact that a standard sort of textbook in this area, a recent textbook, the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology, there are 9 arguments for God that are discussed in that book, only 5 of which appear in The God Delusion. Alvin Plantinga, a famous American Christian philosopher, famously once in the 1980s gave a paper that he called 24 or so arguments for God. A paper that recently spawned a whole academic conference and a book of papers published from that conference called 24 or so arguments for God. which I recommend for these two books for very high-level engagement with these issues. So if Dawkins, even if he does flatten the 10 arguments that he looks at, he's looked at less than half of the arguments that professional philosophers are discussing these days. So Dennett is definitely wrong when he says he flattens all of the serious arguments for the existence of God. Let's just look at one very briefly. The focus of my talk this evening will be, as advertised, the design argument. That's what Dawkins looks at and talks about the most. But the cosmological argument will be a useful bit of background for us here as well. Here, Dawkins noting Thomas Aquinas' argument that a causal regress, one thing causing another thing and something else causing that thing and so on, a regress of causes. Thomas Aquinas argued that such a regress must stop, must terminate somewhere, lest it become an infinite regress that just keeps going and going and going. Well, Dawkins complains that Aquinas makes, as he says, just the entirely unwarranted assumption that God himself is immune to this regress of causality. In other words, you could put it this way: Dawkins, to the cosmological argument of Aquinas, says, yeah, but who made God? But this means that Dawkins simply fails to recognize that the cosmological argument he's discussing just is an argument for the need to recognize the existence of something that is immune to this regress of causality. It doesn't assume it, it argues for it, and Dawkins just doesn't engage with the argument. Let me give you a sort of concrete image, an example of this thinking. Suppose I ask you to loan me a book, and you say to me, well, I don't have a copy of that book right now, but here's what I'll do. I'll ask my friend to lend me his copy, and then I can lend it to you, okay? Well, suppose when you go to your friend to ask them to loan you the book so you can loan it to me, they say exactly the same thing to you. And suppose that just keeps on happening. Well, surely two things should be clear. First of all, if this process of asking to borrow the book just goes on infinitely, then I will never get the book from you. Secondly, if I do get the book from you, then the process that led to me getting it, however long that process may have been, that process could not have been one that was infinite in extent. Somewhere down the line of requests to borrow the book, someone had the book without having to borrow it from anywhere else. Now apply that kind of illustration to thinking about receiving a cause of your existence. Not borrowing a book, but receiving a cause of your existence. Likewise, argues an American philosopher, Richard Purtill, consider any contingent, any caused reality. The same two principles as in that book illustration would apply. If the process of everything getting its existence from something else went on to infinity, then the thing in question would never have been given existence. And if the thing has existence, then the process can't have gone on to infinity. There was something that had existence without having to receive it from somewhere else, just as there had to be someone who had the book without having to borrow it from somewhere else. So a very simple way of putting a cosmological argument would be to argue like this. Two premises, two statements that lead to a conclusion. This is a deductive argument. That means if these two premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. So, claim number one, since it is impossible for everything to be contingent, for everything to be a caused thing, if anything exists, then there must exist a non-contingent, an uncaused, a necessary thing. And I could give two reasons for believing that. First of all, as the illustrations we've looked at indicate, there just can't be an infinite regress of causes. That doesn't explain why something exists. Or think of it this way, look, there's nothing outside of everything to do any causing of anything. So it's impossible for everything to be caused, because what outside of everything is there to do the causing? Well, by definition, outside of everything is nothing. The second claim about reality, something exists. This is very hard to deny. You contradict yourself if you try to deny it. But given those two premises, it just follows deductively that therefore there must exist an uncaused thing, a necessary, non-contingent thing. And then we could ask further questions about the nature of that uncaused thing, but it doesn't seem to be the same kind of thing as the things around us that we know have causes. Dallas Willard sums up the argument this way. The dependent character of physical states, together with the completeness, the non-infinity of that series of dependencies which underlie the existence of any particular given physical thing, logically implies at least one self-existent or therefore non-physical state of being, given that physical things by nature have causes, are contingent. And Dawkins just doesn't really engage with that line of argument. He just says, you're just assuming that God, at the end of that argument, doesn't have a cause. But you see, the argument just is an argument that there must be a thing that doesn't have a cause, and then the argument says, and that's part of what we mean by God. But of course, Dawkins focuses most of his attention on what he thinks of as the designing God temptation. He calls it a temptation to believe in a designer God. The God temptation is the temptation to evade, by invoking a designer, the responsibility to explain the world around us. Of course, what Dawkins calls the God temptation is simply this widely shared intuition that I talked about, that the universe, the cosmos, is best explained by invoking a divine designer of some kind. It's useful to think here, first of all, about issues about the burden of proof, the principle of credulity, the principle of when it's reasonable to believe something. Richard Swinburne, who's a famous British philosopher, notes that it's just a basic principle of knowledge about when it's reasonable to believe things, that we should believe things are as they seem to be until we have evidence that we're mistaken. He says, you don't say, I'm not going to believe anything until you give me evidence that I'm wrong, that I should believe it. Because if you do that, and you applied that principle even-handedly, you would never end up believing anything. You say, I'm not going to believe you until you give me a reason that I should believe you. And so you give me a reason, and I say, yes, but I'm not going to believe that reason really supports that conclusion, that evidence really exists and points to the truth of what you said. I'm not going to believe that you really mean it, and so on, until, of course, I need to have some evidence for those things. And you get into an infinite regress. So he says that the rational thing to do is actually we start with the way the world seems to be to us, and then we are open to changing our minds when people bring forth evidence to show that we were wrong. And we can do that because we don't have to bring forth evidence for the evidence and evidence for the evidence for the evidence in order to change our minds on the basis of other evidence that we trust. So you think of it this way, in very simplistic terms, if it looks like a duck, it's probably a duck. I mean, maybe it's not a duck, maybe it's a robot. A very convincing robot built, no doubt, at the Western University here in Timișoara, or the Polytechnic, depending on which way your loyalties lie. So maybe it's not really a duck, but it looks like a duck, it's probably a duck. To convince me that it's not a duck, you could give me evidence that would change my mind, but it's your job to convince me that I'm wrong about this being a duck. It's not my job to bring forth evidence to show that I'm right, because, I mean, look, it's pretty obviously a duck. That's kind of what Swinburne is saying. So think about design in these terms. The ancient Roman orator Cicero famously said this. He said, "What could be more clear or obvious, more intuitive, when we look up at the sky and contemplate the heavens, than that there is some divinity of superior intelligence?" Or Richard Dawkins, who famously defined biology as the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. And of course he wants to say that that appearance is misleading, but applying kind of Swinburne's thinking, you would have to say it's his job to show, to give us evidence that that appearance is misleading, rather than our job to bring forth evidence that it's not. So we can have a very simple, intuitive level kind of design argument. This is sort of one step beyond just looking and thinking, wow, look at the universe, there must be a God. Again, two premises leading to a conclusion. We can quote from Cicero and from Dawkins and from Swinburne. We can say we ought to believe that things are as they seem to be until we've got reason to think we're wrong. And secondly, those two quotes from Cicero and Swinburne, what could be more clear or obvious when we look at the universe, that there's some divinity of superior intelligence, and biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose, from which it follows that until we have evidence that we're mistaken, we ought to believe that there is some divinity of superior intelligence who designed the universe and designed the world. That kind of sets the starting moves in the debate. It doesn't settle the debate, but it puts the debate about is there a creator in the right context, I think, of the issue of who has the burden of proof. Dawkins points particularly to two areas of the design temptation. And he notes, for example, that you and I and every other living creature are what he calls machines of ineffable complexity, the complexity of a magnitude to challenge our credulity, to challenge our belief. And I appreciate this as a philosopher, he very carefully defines his terms here, which many people don't. But he says here, complexity here means a statistical improbability in a non-random direction. So it's not just complexity, not just unlikeliness, but unlikeliness in a non-random direction, in a specific direction. And as he says, the direction of seeming designed for a purpose. In other words, Dawkins acknowledges what some theoreticians call specified complexity is a plausible indicator of design. Indeed, in an op-ed piece for a Free Inquiry magazine, an atheist magazine, Dawkins wrote that specified complexity as a notion takes care of the sensible point that in the unique arrangement, disposition of its parts, a pile of detached watch parts tossed around in a box. So here we have various cogwheels and the arms of a watch and the face of a watch, and it's all just a jumble of parts. It says this pile of detached watch parts, any jumble arrangement of those parts is just as improbable just as complicated in that sense as a fully functioning, genuinely complicated watch. This is one arrangement of all of those bits out of all of the possible arrangements of all of those bits. Any arrangement of those watch parts is one arrangement out of all of the possible arrangements. So in that sense, they're all equally unlikely. But of course, very few of those arrangements would be a functioning watch, are arranged in the specific direction that seems designed, yeah? that carries out the function. He says what's specified about a watch is it's improbable in the specific direction of telling the time. It achieves this function through its complexity. So Dawkins is saying it's not just that things are complicated that makes them the appeal to design an appealing one, it's the fact that they're complicated in a very specific way. And I think that's right, and this kind of test is used in all sorts of scientific fields for testing hypotheses about design. You know, what, was it murder or was it death by natural causes? Is the radio message that we've received at the antennae, is that just static from space? Is it the pulsing of a pulsar? Or have we made contact with an alien civilization? Well, we would want a signal from space that was not only complicated, but that was specified in this sense, for example, and that would be a good indication that we'd contacted ET. Another concrete illustration, William Lane Craig, an American philosopher, puts it this way. He says, in a poker game, any deal of the cards is equally and highly improbable. But if you find, when you're playing a game, that every time a certain player deals the cards, he ends up getting all 4 aces, you can bet that this is not the result of chance, but of design. And if you challenge that player for cheating, and he said, what are you complaining about? That any arrangement of these cards is equally unlikely. It's just one deal out of all of the possible deals. Well, that wouldn't save him from the annoyed cowboys in Dodge City, would it? So Dawkins, having set this background, which I think I actually agree with him on this, he then says it's, you know, there's a temptation to apply this to the world, and this is where he has a problem. There's an organic and a cosmological design temptation. He says at the organic level, every animal embodies a statistical complexity of detail in a non-random direction indeed. That is, animals exhibit specified complexity. And at the cosmic level, the well-known issue of the fine-tuning of the laws and constants of nature. He says the laws and constants of physics are fine-tuned in such a way as to set up the conditions under which peacocks and humans and our brains and so on can come into existence. He even says it's almost as though you have to have faith that it really is only a trick. Faith that nothing supernatural has happened. How might Dawkins go about rebutting what we call the organic design problem? Well, he appeals to Darwin, as you might expect, and he says Darwin patiently tells us exactly how the trick of life works, cumulative natural selection. Well, there's lots that could be discussed about this, but let me in a sense do an end run around the issue by pointing out that when it comes to the question of the origin of life that is able to undergo evolution by cumulative natural selection, Dawkins' appeal to evolution by cumulative natural selection is, of course, a complete, in English we have the phrase a complete red herring, a complete non-answer. It is itself a sort of trick. Hunt saboteurs used to try and confuse the dogs from chasing the foxes by dragging smelly fish across the path of the hunt, going after hunting the foxes to try and lure them away. My battery is running low, it says it shouldn't be, because this should be turned on, and there should be power coming through this.
Not always. Unless it's unplugged. So
there we go. Ah, yeah, cool.
No.
Perhaps we'll try another plug. Yeah, okay. It likes that. No? Can we... Will it reach to the one on the floor over there, maybe? No, doesn't like that. Okay, let's try that one. Seems like that. Well, okay.
He always leads the 4 aces.
Yeah. So you can't explain the origin of things that have all of the complexity that allows the differentiated passing on of information that can be selected by natural selection as it reproduces and so on. You can't explain the origin of that by appealing to the process that can only get going once you have something complicated enough to undergo that process. So whatever we make of Darwin as an answer to the complexity of life since its origin, appealing to Darwinism or neo-Darwinism or whatever framework of explanation there under the natural sciences in terms of purely natural forces, just doesn't seem to address the issue of where life itself comes from. As the atheist philosopher of science Bradley Monton puts it, Darwinian evolution only comes into play once life already exists. Darwinian evolution doesn't explain or even claim to explain how life came to arise in the first place. So Dawkins has kind of avoided the issue here. In terms of the cosmological, the fine-tuning temptation, Dawkins appeals, as many people do, to the so-called multiverse idea, the idea that there are maybe lots and lots of different universes out there, all with slightly randomly different laws of nature and constants and so on, so that by chance, by luck, it's not actually all that unlikely that our universe, that a universe somewhere would hit upon this specific life-permitting combination of laws. He says there are billions of universes having different laws and constants. Of course, we can only find ourselves in one of the minority of universes that happen to be such that life can exist within it. But if we formalise Dawkins' objection, notice that it goes like this. What he's really saying against the fine-tuning design argument is, if there were enough different universes, then the admittedly specified life-permitting structure of our universe wouldn't actually be complex or unlikely enough to justify making a design appeal, a design inference. There are enough different universes, therefore the fine-tuning doesn't justify this design inference. But I've got premise 2 flashing away here because Dawkins doesn't bring forth any evidence that there are other universes. All he says is there's this theory that there could be, but that's not enough to undermine a design argument. It's a little bit like me saying, okay, it looks like this was not a death by natural causes, it looks like he was murdered. I mean, the guy's got a dagger in between his shoulder blades. But, you know, there could be aliens out there somewhere. Maybe, you know, there are aliens from Alpha Proxima Centauri And maybe they've developed warp technology, although we don't seem to have cracked that one yet. And maybe they came to Earth and something happened where they bumped into this guy and they didn't want to reveal their existence to human beings, and they saw this knife at hand, and they murdered the guy with the knife and then left in their UFO. There's no point in prosecuting any human being for this crime, because maybe there are aliens. Well, okay, maybe there are, but the lawyer in court who presents this theory, hopefully the jury are going to think to themselves, I wonder if that lawyer is going to present us with any evidence that there actually are aliens, and that they actually do have warp-capable spaceships, and they actually did come to Earth, and that they actually were in the same state at the same time as this guy died, and that they are, in the absence of that evidence, just putting out a theory, maybe there are aliens, doesn't really undercut the prosecution's case that it was a murder, and therefore we probably should be looking for a human suspect. Likewise, just saying, well, there's this theory that there are other universes, unless you actually give any evidence that there are other universes. It's a bit like asking the question, was it monkeys or was it, I'm going to mispronounce this, Cassian? If X number of monkeys existed somewhere with enough typewriters and paper, and they're just randomly jabbing away at the typewriters, if there were enough of them, then just by random chance, presumably, they could type Nina Cassian's poems by chance. But anyone faced with the many monkeys hypothesis as an explanation for a collection of her poetry will ask, is there any independent reason to believe in the existence of X number of monkeys, plus typewriters, plus paper, etc.? If not, surely we would be right in favouring the single poet explanation over the many monkeys explanation. Well, as agnostic writer Jim Holt puts it, since other universes are by definition not directly observable from our own, the burden of proof is clearly on those who claim that they exist. Dawkins just doesn't meet this burden of proof. Theoretical physicist Brian Greene says people should be skeptical of multiverse theories simply because there is no evidence supporting their existence. Peter Voigt, in a recent edition of Scientific American, argued that the multiverse did it is just an excuse for failure. It's designed to shut down scientific progress by justifying a failed research program. Atheist Roger Penrose actually argues that there's evidence against multiverse theory. He points out, for example, how ridiculously cheaper in the sense of improbabilities it would be to simply produce, by the mere random collision of particles, the entire solar system with all of its life just ready-made, or even just to produce, by the random fluctuation of particles, a few conscious brains floating in space. So the problem is, well, why did we not come about this way? Which is much more probable, just in likeliness terms, rather than from an absurdly less probable billions of years of evolution. It seems to me this conundrum, this problem, simply points to the incorrectness of the bubble universe, the multiple universe idea. Agnostic cosmologist Paul Davies argues that multiverse theories merely shift the problem up a level from the universe to the multiverse. Within scientific theories of multiverses, he points out there has to be a finely tuned universe-generating mechanism. There has to be a thing that's producing lots of different universes. And it has to be structured such that it doesn't just keep producing the same kind of universe again and again. It has to produce different universes again and again, enough times such that it becomes likely that our kind of life-permitting universe would pop up by chance. but that means to explain the fine-tuning of our universe, you end up appealing to the existence of something that has fine-tuning. So you've just shifted the problem up a level. He says the multiverse theory cannot provide a complete and final explanation of why the universe is fit for life. So, having grasped at a couple of scientific theories to kind of try and rebut this design argument, Dawkins turns his hand to philosophy. And here is really what he thinks of as the key, the central argument of his book. He says the designer himself, in order to be capable of designing, would have to be another complex entity of the kind that in his turn needs the same kind of explanation. In other words, if you appeal to God to explain the design of the universe, you're going to have to appeal to God's God to explain the design of God. And so on, and so on, and so on. We're back to the sort of who made God question in a slightly different form. In the first edition of The God Delusion, he puts it this way in the book. He says, God would have to be highly improbable in the very same statistical sense as the things he's supposed to explain. And in the new foreword of his second edition, he says, this argument remains intact and inescapably devastating. I beg to differ, and we explain why. So we have this statement from Dawkins, the designer himself, in order to be capable of designing, would have to be another complex entity of the kind that in turn needs the same kind of explanation. In other words, one way of thinking of what he's saying is to think he's saying, if you explain the existence of anything with reference to the existence of some other thing that also needs an explanation, then you produce an explanatory regress. Yes, but the question here would be, what's the problem with that? And indeed, positing God, as we saw with the cosmological argument, to posit that God is the terminus of that regress would be to avoid further regress just by definition. Here's another way of thinking what he's getting at. He says, if you're trying to explain something improbable, it can never suffice to invoke an entity that is in itself at least as improbable. But that's just wrong, it seems to me. I mean, here's a self-portrait by the Romanian painter Stefan Lucian. Again, I apologise if I've mispronounced it. Do we make an explanatory advance if we explain the existence of this complex self-portrait in terms of the yet more complex existence of Stefan Lucian, who painted it? He is a lot more complex. Has a lot more specified complexity in him than the painting does. And yet, we do make an explanatory advance when we appeal to his existence in order to explain the existence of that painting. So Dawkins is just wrong, it seems to me, in that statement. As William Lane Craig points out, in order for an explanation to be the best explanation of something, you don't need to have an explanation of the explanation. Indeed, such a requirement would generate an infinite regress, so that everything becomes inexplicable. And we need to try and avoid infinite regresses, yes, and that we've seen God is a way of doing that. But there's nothing wrong with explanatory regresses in and of themselves, so long as they're not infinite regresses. And Dawkins just seems to me to confuse those two notions, to equivocate between them. So perhaps he is just confusing an explanatory regress with an infinite explanatory regress. And I'd agree with him that an infinite explanatory regress is to be avoided. See our discussion of the cosmological argument. And then I point out that if this is what he's doing, well, while explaining A by reference to B doesn't necessarily entail an infinite regress, Dawkins himself, in making this argument, he does generate an infinite regress with that rule that you always need an explanation of the explanation. So it's Dawkins that's falling into infinite regression, not the theist. perhaps, I'm struggling to try and sort of interpret what it's saying in the most sensible way that we can find. Perhaps his thought is that no explanation that's complex in the sense of being an unlikely and thus contingent arrangement of parts, like watch parts. No explanation that refers to that kind of entity can be an ultimate explanation, because contingent things require explanation, things that have specified complexity require a desired explanation, and infinite regresses are to be avoided. Again, I'd agree, but note that in that case, while Dawkins has now unwittingly seemed to endorse both the cosmological and design arguments, he is the one who makes a question-begging assumption that God can't be an uncaused necessary being, and he just assumes that. He doesn't argue for it. He says, critics of my book tried to deny that a God capable of designing something complex must himself be complex in an identical sense, of course. I once bought this, you see this picture here, OMG, design your own deity fridge magnets. Where you've got pictures of all sorts of deities from different religions around the world, and should the mood take you, you can take the head of Ganesh, the Indian elephant god, and stick it on the body of the Buddha, and give him the feet of Jesus or something. Design your own deity. To think that a god is some sort of a contingent arrangement of parts. But that's not what theists understand by God, of course. Here at least Dawkins tries to give an argument that a God who designs the world must himself have that kind of complexity, a contingent arrangement of parts. Why must God be complex rather than, in theological terms, simple? He says God has to be clever enough to calculate the values of the physical constants that would fine-tune the universe. You call that simple? God has to have enough bandwidth to listen to all the prayers of billions of people simultaneously. The one thing God can't be, if he's to match up to the job description, is simple. But here, Dawkins again just misunderstands the people he quotes. He quotes Richard Swinburne again on the simplicity of God. Quotes Swinburne. Swinburne says, theism postulates for its one cause a person with infinite power, infinite knowledge, and infinite freedom, unlimited power, knowledge, freedom, and so on. And then Dawkins comments, God is supposed to be simple for Swinburne because there is only one of him. Yet that one God has to listen to the prayers of billions and so on. You see, he's completely missed the point that Swinburne is driving at. Swinburne's point is not merely that there's only meant to be one God, but rather this, as Swinburne says in the book from which Dawkins quotes. A person could not be a person if they had zero power, knowledge, freedom, and so on. But to suppose a finite limit to these qualities is less simple than to suppose no limit. And to suppose infinite degrees of these qualities bound together eternally is to postulate, to think of the simplest kind of person that there could be. Swinburne argues, if you, for any being that has a limited degree of these personal qualities, that raises the question, well, why do they have only this much knowledge, rather than all the knowledge that could be had? Why do they only have this much power, rather than being omnipotent, and so on? And it's in that sense that God is, for Swinburne and other theologians, simple. J. Wesley Richards, in a useful article on divine simplicity, notes that the doctrine of simplicity is principally, mainly the claim that God's not made up of elements or properties that are more fundamental than God is. In other words, God's not like those fridge magnets. The existence of the different fridge magnets is more fundamental than any picture of a deity you make from their combination. But God's power, or God's knowledge, or God's freedom is not more fundamental than God. They're just part of God. They're not things that can be sort of detached from God and put in a different arrangement. or if you could take God's power away and give it to a rabbit. But Dawkins seems to be thinking of God's qualities like we think of those fridge magnets. And that's just kind of bizarre in a sense. Interestingly, in a discussion with a former Archbishop of Canterbury, hosted and moderated by an agnostic British philosopher called Sir Anthony Kenny. Anthony Kenny stepped in on this issue into the discussion, he couldn't help himself, and he made a distinction. Philosophers love distinctions, and he distinguished between what he called complexity of structure and complexity of function. Complexity of structure or complexity of function, these are two different things. And he gave this illustration. He said, look at this electric razor. An electric razor has much more complexity of structure than a cutthroat razor. But the cutthroat razor has much more complexity of function. The electric razor can basically be used for two things. You can cut your hair with it, or you can use it as a paperweight. The cutthroat razor, you can cut your hair with it, you can use it as a paperweight, you can open letters with it, you can chop bread with it, you can kill someone with it, you can whittle with it and do art, you can do all sorts of things with the very simple structure of a cutthroat razor that you can't do with the very complex structure of the electric razor. So these complexity of structure, complexity of function are different things. And notice, Dawkins' argument for why God can't be simple is basically that God carries out lots of different functions. But showing that God carries out lots of different functions, listens to all of these prayers at the same time and so on, does not prove that God has a complexity of structure. But Dawkins' argument that you can't appeal to God to explain the fine-tuning of the universe and so on because he would have the very same kind of complexity that in its turn would also require a design explanation. The kind of complexity that's involved in that argument is complexity of structure, is specified complexity of structure. So again, Dawkins has talked about the wrong issue, in a sense. And it's instructive to note Dawkins' response to Anthony Kenny when he had made this argument that I've just made to you. This is what Dawkins said. I really don't see what you're saying. And I think that basically says what needs saying about Dawkins' lack of familiarity with philosophical thinking. Well, as the atheist Thomas Nagel puts it, God is not a complex physical inhabitant of the natural world. Or as the atheist philosopher Eric Weilenberg, in a paper reviewing Dawkins' argument likewise, says this. He says, the central atheistic argument of the God delusion, this God would need an explanation in turn argument, is unconvincing. And I agree with Eric Weilenberg here. So must God be complex? Well, Dawkins gives no argument showing that God must be complex in the relevant philosophical sense. Dawkins equivocates. He switches between different meanings of language. He equivocates over the terms complex and simple, basically in order to beg the question against God being simple or necessary in the metaphysical theological senses. Think of it this way, if he'd entitled his book, The Contingent God Delusion, he would probably have sold a lot fewer copies of that book. Because very few theists believe in contingent gods. That's a polytheistic notion of God. The ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans, the ancient Egyptians and so on believed in contingent gods, but monotheists in the Judeo-Christian tradition do not. So in conclusion, Dawkins misunderstands the cosmological argument, doesn't get the point that it's arguing that there needs to be something that ends the regress of causality, and that's part of our picture of God. his appeal to evolution to avoid the biological design temptation just doesn't cover the waterfront. It doesn't address the issue of the origin of things capable of evolving. So it just doesn't address everything that needs addressing. And more fundamental than the biological issue is the issue of why there is a universe in which anything of biological complexity and interest can happen in the first place, this fine-tuning issue. And here, his appeal to the scientific theory of multiverses is not only scientifically unverified, and therefore doesn't carry any weight at the moment in the discussion, but it's actually disconfirmed by scientific evidence. Remember the stuff we quoted from Roger Penrose. And turning to Dawkins' central philosophical argument against the designer, his attempted philosophical responses to the design argument are just unsound. Equivocal, beside the point, question-begging. As the English might say, he just doesn't cut the mustard. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. This is very easy bedtime reading and
Well done. Very
listening.
well.
A lot of contents in what you've said, and I think there is room for a lot of discussion here.
Yes.
Maybe just a preliminary question. In what way may this presentation be available for people who want to listen to it again, or
Sure.
PowerPoint if there is any possibility? So please let us know.
So you're videoing. I don't know whether you're taking just sound or taking pictures as well. If you're taking pictures as well, you have that, but I have a general policy of not giving out my PowerPoint presentations.
That's fair enough.
But I am recording audio for my podcast channel, which is freely available on Podbean or through my website and so on. So if you take a card and note down my website address, give me a week or two to get home and upload it, and it should be there.
With your permission, I think we can upload it.
Yeah, absolutely. You feel free to upload it onto your website if you have one, etc. So.
Ok, deci simțiți liber să transmiteți și altora care ar putea fi interesați. Pot să asculte, deci în format audio, pe site-ul lui sau în format video pe site-ul Centrului Areopagus. Thank you so much for allowing us to put it on our website as well, and like you said, we can also see the presentation in PowerPoint. Okay, who wants to break the ice? Cine sparge gheața?
I want to ask you a question.
Please.
If you see that there is a contradiction between creationism and intelligent design.
Right, okay. The question is there a contradiction between creationism and intelligent design? And as a philosopher, of course, I'm going to say it depends crucially what you mean by those things, because different people may have different understandings of what those things are. Intelligent design is a fairly minimal scientific theory that applies this tool of design detection that are already used in other scientific fields, and says we should be free to apply that tool within the realm of cosmology and biology, and so we should be free to apply that anywhere and to follow the evidence where it points. So if there's evidence that seems to pass that test for design, we should be free to say that in these instances it seems that there's evidence that passes this test for design, and therefore we've got good reason to believe that these things at least are the product of design. and that this should go in biology, in cosmology, just as much as it could go in forensic science or SETI or computer code hacking or what have you. People who advance this theory want to claim that it's a scientific theory, but that's a kind of secondary issue to the issue of whether or not it's true, because things can be true without being scientific. And I would argue, if the theory is true, if it's true that we've got reliable tests for design, and it's true that there's evidence within the fabric of nature that pass those tests, then I think it would be very odd not to commit the name science to that project of thinking about the world. Because what's your alternative? Are you going to suddenly cut funding to the science department and channel it all to the theology department in order to better understand cosmology? They wouldn't have the right expertise to do that. So intelligent design theory is a very sort of minimal claim, and it's nothing to do with particular interpretations of biblical passages. It's not tied to any particular religious tradition. There are intelligent design theorists who are not Christian. There are intelligent design theorists in other religious traditions with no tradition. Whereas creationism, although at one level you could say that just means belief in a creator, belief that we are the product of a creator, God. It has come to be particularly associated with so-called young earth creationism, which is tied to thinking that a specific way of interpreting certain biblical passages related to creation are to be interpreted as requiring belief in a relatively young, 10,000-year-old earth, taking the days of creation in Genesis in a fairly literal kind of 24-hour day, consecutive 24-hour day kind of interpretation of them, and so on. And then scientific creationism tries to argue that interpretation of Scripture is consistent with or even supported by independent scientific evidence. So, it would be possible to be both a young earth creationist and to subscribe to intelligent design theory, as for example the philosopher of science Paul Nelson in the United States does. But it's also possible to subscribe to intelligent design theory, like I do, without subscribing to young earth creationism, as I don't. And other people in that category would be Michael Behe, the Catholic biologist who wrote Darwin's Black Box, for example. So you can be a creationist and an intelligent design theorist, or you can be one or the other, but they're separable ideas, that they don't, believing in one doesn't automatically mean believing in the other. Does that address what you were asking?
Okay. Yes, I thought about the book of Francis Collins, The Language of God.
Yes.
He, as I understood, he is a Christian creationist, but he has some critics about intelligent
right,
design.
sure. So in the sense of believing in a creator, of course, even Christians who agree with some kind of neo-Darwinian scientific theory are creationists. They would just say Darwinian theory is a description of the way in which God created the world to work. And so, yes, there are creationists in the general sense of believing in a creator, believing that there is an intention and a purpose behind our existence here, and that the intended, the proposer of our existence is the God of the Bible, who are not either young Earth creationists or intelligent design theorists. So these theories don't all have to bundle together. You can separate them out. And indeed, you know, the question, do you believe in evolution, which many people will ask, is in a sense far too simple, because evolution means lots of different things as well. It means at least half a dozen different things. And you might agree with some of those statements, but not others. So some people mean by evolution mean the theory of common ancestry, that all present life is related to other life back and back and back in time and to the origin of life. The theory of universal common ancestry. Some people explain that pattern of divergence from a universal common ancestor by appealing to a neo-Darwinian process of variation and natural selection. But you don't have to. You could agree with common ancestry, but reject the neo-Darwinian explanation of common ancestry. This is something that Michael Behe does. He believes in common ancestry, but he rejects neo-Darwinism as a sufficient explanation of that pattern. And yet, many atheists in the discussion use the term evolution sort of to mean both things at once, and don't distinguish them. So it's very important in these discussions to be clear on the distinctions between things before we then ask the question of the relationship between them. We have to know how many different things are we talking about, and then we can start getting clear about how they relate to each other, and which ones are consistent with each other and which ones are not consistent with each other, and so on. Yeah.
Please.
If you can suggest some books that will help us to understand Dawkins from more Christian.
Sure, okay. This is where I risk, as an author, advertising my own writings, but apart from my own writings, which you can find about through my website, you can get other takes on Richard Dawkins, for example, by reading relevant works by the English theologian Alistair McGrath. He's a theistic evolutionist, but who disagrees with Richard Dawkins. So, you know, a creationist in the general sense, of course. He wrote a very nice, fairly thin little book responding to Dawkins called, I think it was called The Dawkins Delusion. And on the front cover of that book, he had an endorsement quote from the atheist philosopher Michael Roos, who specialises in the philosophical debate about evolution. And Michael Roos said on the front cover of McGrath's book, this book shows why, I'm paraphrasing, but you know, it shows why Richard Dawkins is the sort of atheist that calls other atheists to put their head in their hands. Shows why Dawkins is completely off topic here. Again, just as we're careful to distinguish between philosophical positions, we must be careful not to paint all atheists as having the same views. We know from our experience in Christians, different Christian denominations and churches have theological disagreements among ourselves. Well, it's the same for atheists as well. They're not a monolithic collection of people. Atheists have deep disagreements amongst themselves. And in a sense, the critique that I've given of Dawkins this evening, as that you picked up at the end, that I quoted some criticism of Dawkins from atheist philosophers like Thomas Nagel, like Eric Weilenberg, who are professional atheist philosophers who say that Richard Dawkins, his engagement with philosophy is just not very good. It doesn't work. But they're still atheists. Okay? This is not a criticism of, in a sense, of atheism, first and foremost. This is a criticism of Richard Dawkins's arguments for being an atheist. And of course, I have suggested a couple of reasons, the cosmological and design arguments that I do think are good arguments for design. But there are much better criticisms of arguments for God that are put forward by Richard Dawkins in The God Delusion. If you really want to engage at the high level with these issues, Dawkins is not where you start reading. Yes.
Maybe it's strange what I'm asking. I don't know why I have the feeling that while talking about this continuous regression argument and also about the evolutionary argument, these are arguments that need, in a way, in order to be valid, they need this linear time. They need this Newtonian linear time from past to future in order to regress continuously or to evolve from something that was in something that will be. But God is eternal. God transcends this linear time. It is I am who I am. It's a state of it's a mystery, but I in my intuition it's a being that transcends this linearity. So in a way, these arguments are very relative to a very limited world in which we perceive this time as linearity. Because from a transcendental or religious point of view, we deal with eternity. God is eternal, so it's something much larger. It's something else.
Okay, let me try and think of a few comments that relate to that. On the one hand, I would want to say that the issue of God's relationship to time is one of those issues that different Christian theologians and philosophers disagree with each other about. So there is a school of Christian thought that thinks of God as completely outside of time, atemporal. That God doesn't have time at all.
I think he is in time but eternal.
Right, and so there are then becomes a question as well. How more precisely do we think of that? What do you mean by in time but eternal? It's like, is that a contradiction, or how do you spell that out? Yeah, is it just a paradox or is it a contradiction? And so there are a number of different schools in the debate on the issue of God's relationship to time, who put forward different theories of how we think of God in relationship to time, or completely outside of time, as some would say as well. But no, I don't think this has a direct impact on these arguments. First of all, because, for example, the arguments that Dawkins makes in response themselves also assume a linear view of time. So you have an evolutionary process where things go from simple in the past to complex in the present through time. You have the theory of a multiverse that's being produced by some physical multiverse mechanism within quantum mechanics or something, where you once had fewer universes and now you have lots more. So they're engaging on this level of linear time, and I think we have the best of the arguments that point to something non-physical and non-contingent, something that's not a contingent arrangement of parts and so on, beyond or outside in some sense of the physical universe. And it's at that stage that we get into the discussion about, well, what is the relationship between that universe transcending creator and what we might mean by time? So obviously God doesn't depend upon what William Lane Craig calls physical clock time. That's measured by the expansion of the universe over time, say, because he created that universe. But that doesn't mean that you couldn't have, say, metaphysical notions of time, which are part and parcel of God's very character. So if you have a non-physical mind, no physical reality, and that mind is just thinking sequentially to itself. Thinking 1, 2, 3. No. I've had at least 3 thoughts now. I used to be thinking about 1, I'm now thinking about 3. In a sense, you say, well, that's time, but it's not physical. not dependent upon anything physical by the very definition of the thought experiment, as it were. So you can have notions of time that are unrelated to physical time, for example. That's just one of the different views in this area. So it's a very interesting issue, but I think it's more one that tends to come up later, apart from the fact that you could say, for example, if you're a theistic evolutionist, and you say, yeah, God just created a world where things would evolve by this process of natural selection, and it's not that God is intervening within that process to make sure that it ends up creating human beings. It's just that he knew that that would be the outcome, because God's eternal and he has foreknowledge and middle knowledge and and so on, and so that would be one way of holding both together, perhaps. Yeah.
I also have a question. Do you think it would be fair to say that according to Dawkins, the world that we live in is terribly deceptive?
Yes.
I'm referring, for instance, to his definition of biology as the study of, I know here, of complicated things that have the appearance of having been created for a purpose. And
it's a deceptive appearance.
Yes, there is a lot of deception. Infinite numbers of ducks, which all seem like ducks everywhere around us, but none of them seem to be ducks. So in that respect, would it be fair to say that according to his description, the world that we live in is terribly deceptive? And I wonder how, if that is so, how to respond to that kind of charge.
Yes, I think yes, but I think his response would be to say, but humans have discovered the scientific method, which is a reliable way of knowing things, a reliable way of us discovering when we've been deceived by the appearance of nature. We've discovered that this appearance of design is misleading because Darwin has shown how the trick works, for example. Maybe religious people in the past have used to think that our intuitions about morality were telling us things that were true about the world, that it's true that torturing children for fun is evil. We have this sort of gut reaction to it. But now we know that there's no designer, and we're just the product of a mindless Darwinian evolutionary process. We know that this is just something that our genes in the past have programmed us to feel that way about that action, because in the past it wasn't useful to spreading our genes to torture children, because obviously if you torture children they tend to die, and if they die you're not spreading your genes. Okay? Something like that. Some sort of evolutionary process. And so now we've seen through this idea that we really have moral intuitions that tell us about moral facts. So it seems to us that there are moral facts, but that's a misleading impression. And we have this alternative naturalistic explanation for why it seems to us that there are moral facts. Again, that seems to me not to actually address the issue. It actually comes in. He's really pushing the explanation of, if we had come to the conclusion that our moral intuitions are misleading, they're not telling us truths about reality, then we would face the question, well, how come we have these moral intuitions? Because maybe we were tempted in the past to think, well, God designed us that way, to have those moral intuitions. And if we get rid of God, then we face the question, well, why do we have these moral intuitions? And Darwinism can come along and sort of plug that gap in our understanding of reality. Again, just
so you no longer have God as an answer to everything, you have Darwin as an answer to everything.
But they're not necessarily contradictory answers in and of themselves, because again, you could say, how has God arranged for us to come to have these moral intuitions? By creating a biological process that he knew would lead to us having those intuitions. Okay, so simply pointing to the scientific explanation doesn't get rid of the God bit. doesn't contradict it automatically. As John Lennox puts it in the design context, pointing, as Dawkins does, to design to get rid of the idea of designing, Darwin to get rid of designing in God, is a bit like looking at a Model T Ford, fresh off Henry Ford's production line, when he invented the car, mass-produced the car, and saying, now we understand the laws of motor mechanics and combustion and engineering. We've got all of these scientific explanations for how this vehicle works, therefore we don't need to believe in Henry Ford. And it's just addressing the wrong issue.
There's an epistemological objection to Darwinism formulated by Darwin himself, which, if I remember rightly, goes, can a mind, then a doubt arises, can a mind descended, I believe, from such lowly origins be trusted when it draws such grand conclusions? Which is honest and, in a sense, fairly devastating, directed by Darwin against himself. I wonder if Dawkins engages with this epistemological dimension at all.
No. Again, Dawkins is not art, but this debate about whether a naturalistic description of what we are as human beings undermines our trust in our own rationality. This is really the question that Darwin, as you say, himself raised, which was raised famously by C.S. Lewis in his book Miracles, which has been raised recently in a very sophisticated form by the American Christian philosopher Alvin Plantinga, which has been raised by a number of atheist thinkers in recent times, like Thomas Nagel raises this issue, again, particularly in his book Mind and Cosmos. Well worth reading. The subtitle of Thomas Nagel's book Mind and Cosmos is Why the Neo-Darwinian Picture of Reality is Almost Certainly False. He's an atheist philosopher of mind from the United States. Well worth reading the book Mind and Cosmos, where you see an atheist seriously grappling with these issues and kind of seeing how they're pushing him towards a belief in God, but he really doesn't want to go to that conclusion, so he's really struggling to find some sort of alternative and admits that he doesn't really find one. But he's going to keep looking because he really doesn't want the God conclusion. But yeah, it's a real serious issue debated by philosophers in the journals and things today, and Dawkins is just not really aware of that conversation. And I've heard, I think it was Paul Copan, the American philosopher, Dawkins was on a book tour in the United States. I've heard a recording of Paul Copan asking Dawkins that question about, if you explain our minds, everyone's minds is explained by a mindless process that in inverted commas only cares about what works, not what's true. It's not aiming at producing true beliefs, it's just aiming at spreading our genes and whatever works, right? Truth works, but so do lies often work. So does this
sometimes better?
How can you say that the atheist who concludes there's no God is necessarily being more rational than the Christian who concludes that there is a God, given that both of their minds, on Dawkins' view, are just the product of this mindless process that's not even trying to aim at truth? And Dawkins, just in his reply, it was clear that he just didn't understand the question. He'd never thought of the question before.
It's interesting. Richard Dawkins is the creator of the word meme.
Yes.
Which has, as they say, gone viral. So it's an interesting example of how an intelligent mind can create something which takes on a life of its own.
Yeah.
Silvio, you want to say?
Yeah, I apologize, I have to go. I super appreciated the speech, and I shared with some friends just before we arrived. On the way here, I thought, why is it that I am not really concerned with these issues? And it's interesting how some of us, I hope we are alright, I kind of find it an extra effort for me, for my own type of personality. It's something that is not necessary. I don't say waste of time, but it's not necessary. Simply because for me, things are so, in a sense, not obvious. I have my doubts in big ways. But in a sense, I find it difficult to keep going to the analytical. This is what I want to bring to the question here. Yeah. And my colleague from the university just mentioned that earlier. I recognize the same thing. There are schools, philosophical schools and philosophical or schools of thought. Analytical minds are craving for this, are very much interested for it. But then I'm more continental-minded philosopher, and for me things seem to be way beyond these kind of arguments for many other reasons, for many reasons. But I know, I'm aware these are arguments coming from a different perspective. Yeah. You mentioned at the beginning there are 40, double dozens, 2,000s of arguments. Right. I'm thinking, for instance, of Jung, Carl Gustav Jung. He was once asked in an interview, "Sir, do you believe in God?" And he was kind of literally, you can see, kind of says, "What do you mean? I mean, I know there is God. I don't need to believe." It's that kind of awareness of the other thing that is way bigger than us.
And that's right. I mean, that's why I wanted to try and make the connections at the beginning with our basic intuitions about reality, and say that the sort of the academic philosophical debate is connected to that very widespread intuitional sort of level of thinking about the world. In philosophy, we start, as Swinburne was saying, from what seems to be the case, and then we work out and get more and more complicated from there. And of course, not everyone's personality is the same, nor should it be, and we're not all called to be professional analytical philosophers, and that's good, because we'd all starve if that was the case. We wouldn't have any computers to show our PowerPoint on, because no one would be doing computing studies, and so on. So that's good. But as I say, for those who have that kind of approach to thinking about the world, this can be really useful and empowering, and also in terms of our evangelism. It may not be a subject that interests us, but if we discover that it is a topic that is really shaking the faith of a family member because they've read a Richard Dawkins book, or a colleague in our university department has this kind of scientific worldview, etc.
I just wanted to make a point of having different views at this issue. For instance, I had my own major problems in terms of justifying meaning and faith, but they come through different window. Sure. For instance, I just had fun when I read recently that Jacques Derrida was supposed to be given an honorary doctorate in Cambridge in the 80s. And all the major philosophers alive in Cambridge stopped it and said, "It's no way that we give a doctoral degree to this guy. He does rubbish with everything we do. He's trashing out everything we do." So he constructs everything, plays with us, and he's just making fun. But at the same time, I take him very seriously, because you can do that. If you lose reference systems, then you lose everything. You are lost. You lose your own identity. So.
And I think there was a bigger divide in sort of C.S. Lewis's day, in the early 20th century. Analytic philosophy got in this rut about language and how we use it and what it means, and scientism, and avoiding the big metaphysical questions. But there was a revolution in philosophy in the sort of 1960s-ish, and those big metaphysical questions of things like the meaning and purpose of life, and is there a God, and the problem of evil, and what is a good life, and virtue theory, and so on, all came back in. So I think there's perhaps more in common between the so-called sort of continental, reading, and of course the continent has produced lots of great analytical philosophers, historically speaking, and lots of analytical philosophers from the British-American tradition are very interested in writers like Pascal and Kierkegaard and so on. So
anybody else who has not?
Could you argue that intuition is a product of education?
Well, one could try and argue that, but
it could be an argument.
I think sociologically, historically speaking, the intuition that there is some kind of deity of superior intelligence is one that's been shared across cultures over a very long historical period, and so it's harder to argue that that is specifically shaped by a particular educational culture than maybe some other beliefs you might be able to point to. So if Cicero, who's a pagan Roman, can say the same sort of things about the heavens declaring the glory of the Lord as Paul, who's a Jew educated in Greek thought, can say the same sort of thing as Aristotle was saying 500 years earlier, and as you can find this sort of intuition and creator in far-flung tribes and cultures and so on around the world, in different civilizations over as long a historical period as we have recorded history for, then yeah, it would be pretty difficult to argue that, oh, that we can just dismiss that because it's the product of this particular sort of educational system or whatever. Yeah.
In a way, this way of transmitting through generations that happens also in tribes and so on,
sure,
is a way of education. But then you could go on and it just has to stop somewhere.
Yes, you can't have an infinite regress, that's right. And people's intuitions, I think, have to change. People can question their tradition and change traditions and things, and this is one that has continued on through thousands of years of history and has crossed across cultures and so on. And we ask, do our intuitions chime with what we're being told by our elders? And if they don't, then that does call into question the tradition in which we're living, or what we're being told, or our intuition. We start wrestling with it, and then perhaps we start thinking at a more analytical level about things, and perhaps giving reasons that justify or argue against our intuitions, and then we're into the philosophical debate, which again is a very long-standing cross-cultural debate, where, at least historically speaking, the majority of the great philosophers have believed in some kind of creation.
Okay, maybe time for one last quick question and one quick answer if someone has not had the chance to ask.
I have one. First of all, I want to say that I'm a believer, but I put many questions. Some of them are funny questions or bad questions, I don't know. I want to say that as humans we have finite minds, and when we make assumptions about God, we make assumptions about something infinite. And how do we know that our assumptions of any idea of concept are true or good concept?
Again, I start from the point of we start working from what seems to be the case, whilst being open to being convinced that we're wrong. The only alternative to that methodology is to start with a very deep skepticism about our ability to know and reason without anything, from which there is no rescue, right? There's no rational rescue. So the choice is really, are we going to try and be as reasonable as we can, help each other, critique each other, and so on, to be as reasonable as we can, knowing that we're fallible, which gives us a sense of humbleness in the process, our openness to being, show me a good argument why I'm wrong and I'll change my mind. That sort of commitment to the truth as opposed to my truth. Yeah, that's the commitment of the true philosopher. Or we just go, I don't know, go and play backgammon, as David Hume said. But even to play backgammon, you have to trust in the reliability of your senses, and how we treat other people and so on is bound up with our notions of what kind of things they are, whether they really exist or not. I might treat you very differently if I were convinced, as some people have theorized, that we're all living in an artificially constructed world in a computer. This is all a computer program. We're all in the matrix kind of thing. And maybe I'm the only real person here, and you are all artificial intelligences, or the avatars of alien gaming teenagers who are playing the "let's be a human" game, you know. Well, again, like, okay, there's a theory. If that theory were true, then I am drastically deluded about the kind of reality that I'm living in. But it's the conspiracy theorist's job to give us a good reason to believe that that conspiracy theory is true. It's not our job to show him that our common sense picture of reality is the correct one. It's about who reasonably bears that burden of proof or justification. And I think we start with our basic intuitions, some of which we just can't escape, some of which we could do without, but they seem really, really strong and basic. And they are the only things that allow us to get this process of arguing and critiquing our understanding of the world underway in the first place. You've got to start from somewhere in order to do anything. So are you going to do nothing? Can you? Or are you going to try and just do the best with what you have? And that's what the philosophical tradition historically tries to do.
Okay, thank you so much, and I'm sure you know, if you'll still be available for a few minutes,
yes,
if people want more informally to talk to you.
Absolutely.
Once again, we want to say a very deep thank you for coming all the way to Timișoara and for giving such a dense and important presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Please, I encourage you to take one of these cards, and also please find some time and take a look at the website. You have a lot of interesting presentations there, both audio and video presentations on a very wide range of topics. Feel free to send forward to other people also if you think they are interested to listen or to hear. And also on behalf of Areopagus, just symbolically to say thank you so much for coming here. Thank you, and hope to have you again here sometime.
Chocolate is always good. Thank you.
Yes, and something with
I'm going to share the presents with you.
Sure. I don't know how many of them are, how long it takes, but
I'm going to guess that this is some sort of pen, maybe?
Well,
it looks like a pen box.
But it may not be a duck, you know.
Yes, that's right. I'm open
it's
to
not how it seems.
Oh no, it's 2 pens. There you go. It's on the right lines, you see? It looks like a pen box, it's probably a pen box.
Okay, thanks again. Just before we close, Lucy, would you like to come and say a few words about Cambridge Papers, please?
Da, o să vorbesc de românește. Nu știu, cred că majoritatea sunteți familiarizați cu proiectul nostru Cambridge Papers. E un proiect de traducere și distribuire a unor articole care sunt traduse din limba engleză, publicate de Fundația Jubilee Center. Sunt mulți scriitori care sunt autorități în domeniul lor, creștini autentici care încearcă să răspundă la nevoile societății de azi, la diferite subiecte și încearcă să ofere o perspectivă creștină. În seara asta lansăm 3 numere. E vorba de numărul 31, cum se construiește o societate bazată pe relații, a lui Michael Schluter, care încearcă să răspundă la întrebarea cum ne putem îndrepta spre o bunăstare relațională, spre o societate a bunăstării în zilele noastre. Punctul de plecare este legea mozaică pe care Dumnezeu o dă poporului Israel și încearcă să creeze relații corecte pentru poporul Israel. De la acestea, prin cadrul instituțiilor, a proceselor, a resurselor, împreună cu alte învățături biblice extinse, încearcă să ne învețe pe noi cum putem, în societatea noastră, cu toate provocările pe care le avem, să ne îndreptăm spre o bunăstare relațională și spre schimbarea societății. Al doilea număr, numărul 32, e Siguranță într-o societate a riscului. Autoarea Amy Donovan încearcă să ne facă conștienți că trăim într-o societate a riscului, o societate care își pune tot mai mult întrebarea ce să facem pentru a controla riscurile care există. Avem la dispoziție multe tehnologii, asta duce cu sine multă cunoaștere care ne face să ne dăm seama de potențiale riscuri și la rândul nostru încercăm să vedem ce putem face pentru a le controla. Autoarea vine cu perspectiva creștinismului, care este distinct de celelalte religii, încearcă să ofere câteva idei din exemple biblice despre ce putem cunoaște despre riscuri și cum le putem gestiona și în aceeași măsură vine să ne pună întrebarea și să evaluăm ca și creștini cum putem să nu putem să controlăm viitorul, dar ce putem să facem e cum putem să ne planificăm viitorul în așa fel încât să nu-L excludem pe Dumnezeu din ecuație, pentru că, așa cum spunea Ulrich Beck, riscul apare în societate atunci când Dumnezeu a părăsit scena. Ultimul număr e numărul 33, Criza identității umane și de ce e importantă Trinitatea, al lui Michael Owie. Doctrina Trinității vine să răspundă la provocările individualismului și a uniformității care caracterizează societatea occidentală în zilele noastre, iar studiind corect doctrina Trinității, putem vedea care este valoarea fiecărui individ și cum putem să aflăm cu adevărat care este identitatea noastră umană. În seara aceasta, pentru toți participanții, avem câte un exemplar gratis, nu doar din aceste 3 volume care se lansează, ci și din celelalte care sunt puse aici. Așa că sper să vă bucurați de citit și dacă citiți și aveți observații, comentarii, aprecieri, m-aș bucura foarte mult să îmi trimiteți un e-mail și dacă sunt 2 rânduri pe elena@areopagus.ro în care să-mi spuneți toate acestea legate de proiectul Cambridge Papers. Mulțumesc și o seară frumoasă!
Ok, mulțumim încă o dată tuturor pentru participare, să aveți un timp bun în continuare, noapte bună!